Good morning, Asbury. Welcome to the first Sunday in Advent, where we begin the journey of preparing for the birth of Christ. We're so glad you're here this morning. And if you're visiting us, we hope we're glad that you chose to be with us this morning. We hope you will find this service an inspiring service. And hopefully you received a visitor's packet. And if you would fill out that blue sheet, and either put it in the offering plates or put it in the boxes out front. During the week, Pastor Chelsea or I will contact you and try to connect you with things you are interested in and things that and talk with you about things you care about. Our theme for this morning is how those who walk in the way of Jesus, how do we find security in a way that's different from the way our world defines security? So we'll be talking about that. And our inspirations for our Advent themes this year is the Carol of the Epiphany, and so we decided to sing the whole carol during our first hymn this morning so that you will be aware of the words and how the verses all fit together. And so as the acolytes prepare to bring in the light of Christ, we ask that you prepare your hearts and minds and take a moment to center and be ready for this service of worship. And when we get to the lighting of the Advent candle, if you would stand and remain standing for the opening hymn. Thank you. Please be seated.
Our passage this morning is part of a lengthy communal lament and seems to reflect a time of difficulty and doubt in the life of the returned community from exile in Babylon. The temple in Jerusalem, a sign of God's presence among the people, is still in ruins as the people return. Their high hopes for a renewed life in Jerusalem seem dashed as the promised land looks more like a wasteland than the previous generations described as a land flowing with milk and honey. The end of this passage is a plea to God to accept their penitence and lead them once again. This is Isaiah 64, verse 1 through 9. Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down, so that the mountains would quake at your presence, as when fire kindles brushwood and the fire causes water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, so that the nations might tremble at your presence. When you did awesome deeds that we did not expect, you came down, the mountains quaked at your presence. From ages past, no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you, who works for those who wait for him. You meet those who gladly do right, those who remember you in your ways. But you were angry, and we sinned. Because you hid yourself, we transgressed. We have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a filthy cloth. We all fade like a leaf, in our iniquities, like the wind, take us away. There is no one who calls on your name or attempts to take hold of you, for you have hidden your face from us and have delivered us into the hand of our iniquity. Yet, O Lord, you are our creator. We are the clay, and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand. Do not be exceedingly angry, O Lord, and do not remember iniquity forever. Now consider, we are all your people. May God bless this reading from the prophet Isaiah.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we ask that you open our hearts and minds that we might be open to the leading of your Spirit this morning. Amen. The people of Israel had been living in exile for a long, long time. At least 2 generations earlier, their country had been conquered by Babylon, and many of the families, the farmers, the rabbis, and all the faithful folk had been carted off to live in Babylon so they would not cause trouble back in Israel. We believe that they lived there for at least 2 generations before they were allowed to return to Jerusalem. Perhaps you've seen those old television ads about a celebrity cruise where we see a husband and wife who have gone back to work after being on a cruise, and they talk about living in temporary exile because they long to be back on the cruise ship. Well, the people of Israel had an even more intense longing to go home. Most of them had never seen their homeland. They only knew about it from tales that their grandparents told them. Even their parents, who either were very young when they left or were born in exile, couldn't remember much of Israel. And I'm sure many of you know what it's like to listen to your grandparents talk about a time great in the past, or a great place, and you go there and it's not quite like they had remembered. And so for the people of Israel, their wonderful place was a place where they had lived free and where they had had their own rulers, and most importantly, it was a place where they had come to know God, and that was the land of Israel. Finally, after years and years of exile, they are allowed to return. But it wasn't what they expected. It certainly didn't seem like the land that their grandparents had described to them. Most everything was in ruin. The buildings and homes that weren't ruined during the war had deteriorated from neglect. The farms had grown wild, and the domestic animals, there weren't very many of them. And so the return is not the great homecoming that they expected, the one that they had dreamed about for years. And so then the people begin to wonder, well, where is God? And why isn't God present? And so Isaiah prays on their behalf. Oh God, that you would rip open the heavens and descend. Make the mountains shudder at your presence, as when a forest catches fire, as when fire makes a pot to boil. The people aren't afraid of God. They just want some unmistakable sign that God is present. They want to be assured that God will keep them safe and secure as God has done in the past. One of my favorite preachers, Fred Craddock, suggests that the presence of God is easily missed because what may have originally happened in rather muted tones is later reported in Technicolor in the Bible. For instance, when Luke tells of the death of Herod, he says that God struck him dead instantly and that he was eaten up with worms. And you'll find that in the 12th chapter of Acts. However, history tells us that the original Herod died of gout. Very exciting. The book of Exodus says that God buried the chariots of the Egyptians so that the Hebrews who were fleeing from slavery, could make their escape. And yet, the contemporary historians of that time, who kept meticulous records of everything, failed to note such an event. But maybe that was because to the casual onlooker, it was just a matter of the Egyptian chariots getting stuck in the mud, so the Hebrews were able to escape. But in the eyes of people of faith, God stepped in and dramatically saved them from the Egyptians. You know how preachers sometimes, in order to make a point, in order to be heard, sometimes overstate things? And I think it's that way in the Bible also. The voice of God, which was a whisper to someone, is reported as a huge shout. And so these returning Israelites long for not the whisper of God's presence, but the shout. But do we also not long for God's presence? As we begin the season of Advent and prepare to celebrate the birth of God's Son, we find ourselves living in an insecure and chaotic world. Here are some of the headlines I've taken over the last few months. The AIDS, HIV, and malaria epidemics in Africa continue on, and there continue to be more orphans. Terrorists continue to plot and bomb almost anywhere in the world, and nations and people have learned that no one is safe from a terrorist bomb. The death toll for soldiers and men and women and children in Syria and now Yemen continues to rise. Farmers and children around the globe where their wars have been fought continue to be threatened in their work and their play by landmines. Gated communities continue to pop up around the world, creating a growing chasm between the wealthy and everyone else. Our schools, continue to struggle with how can we create a safe environment so our children can learn. I could go on and on. Safety and security are not far from the minds of many in our daily life. So how do we respond? The biblical record and the teachings of Jesus affirm that the way to security is not wars, it is not guns, and it is not higher and deeper walls. These are attempts at getting security that are based in fear. and they don't work. History has shown that year after year after year. The teachings of Jesus affirm that the way to security is to work for a society and a world, we need both, and a world where peace and justice reign. So to put it in today's term, that is to work for a world where everyone has access to nutritious food and housing and clothing and medical care and security in their older ages, education, healthy environments, and if they are working, a living wage. And so I think a question for us to pray about this Advent is, what is the next step we can take in our neighborhood, at our school, in our community, in our country, in the world, to create these kinds of communities? God sent Jesus into the world to remind us once again that we are all connected. We belong to God, and we are to care for each other. And not just the each other that we know or live by us, but the all of each other, regardless of where we live, what kind of status we were born to, what color our skin is, what language we preach. God calls us to care for all of the others. And we are also to care for the creation, which God has shared with us. We need to remember that Jesus was not born into a wealthy or a powerful family. He was born into a family that was poor. This family had no power, and they lived on the margins. A reminder that the least among us counts hugely in the eyes of God. Isaiah put it another way. God is the potter, and we are the clay. God continues to mold us in so many ways so that we might become the community that God wants us to be, a community of peace and justice where all are welcome and all basic needs are cared for. This morning we have an image of God holding the world, reminding us that even in our darkest fears, even in our darkest times, God is at work trying to mold and shape us so that the world will reflect the reign of God. And even though God is our potter, and as persons we are created in God's image, we become co-potters in the shaping of the rest of the world because that's the way God made it to be. And so I'm going to ask Michelle in a moment if she will sing the verse of our Advent carol again for today, reminding us that God is in the scariest places of our lives. And invite you, and while she's singing and afterwards, I want to invite you to think of a simple prayer and write down one or two words. You have a hand in your bulletin, so if you'd find your hand, take a moment to find that. And while we're listening to the carol, I want to invite you to write a prayer to use during Advent, a prayer for your home, for our nation, for our world, that we would become places of justice and peace and love. And you can just write a couple of key words on this hand. And after Michelle sings, she'll have a few moments to do this. And I want to invite you to take it home and put it on your Christmas tree or put it somewhere where you'll see it to remind you to pray daily that we might be agents of God's justice and peace and love in the world. So Michelle?
Remote
peace in our homes and pray daily for justice and peace and love in our world.